Hi, welcome to Videos from the Ville. I'm Professor Charles Greenewalt, and this is Introduction to City Planning. We're happy to have you join us this semester. And perhaps this whole academic year will be a little different than what we're used to, won't it be? I certainly prefer the traditional classroom setting, and I'm sure that many of you do as well. But we're going to make this distance education work this semester, and looking forward to working with you through the course of the semester and in this class. A little bit, you have received the welcome sheet for the class, and you received the syllabus. And I want all of you to understand that you can call me anytime between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. Again, on my cell phone number, which was given to you on the syllabus and on the welcome sheet. My office hours, again, are from 12 to 1. Monday through Friday, 12 to 1. And then again, you can call me any time if you need to, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. But my office hours will be 12 to 1. Let's see, what else to cover here. I think all the details about the class are spelled out on the syllabus. And I'm sure I will be sending out some follow-up memos as well to all of you to try to perhaps clarify different aspects of the syllabus for you as the time goes by. But wanted to start out with the initial material. We're going to take a look at city planning, the introduction to it, the definition of a city, and the history of a city. Now, normally in the class, I would have everyone go around and introduce themselves, talk a little bit about themselves, what their background is, and what they hope to get out of this class. What I'd also do is introduce myself and give you a little bit of background why I might be able to teach this or why I might be offering this. City planning has been a long love of mine, but most of you are juniors and seniors, and you have been with me before, so you know most of my background. But let me just, for those of you who haven't been with me, let it suffice to say that one of my internships when I was here at Millersville as an undergraduate, the last one that I had was with the Harrisburg City Planning Bureau. And I worked for them for a season and truly enjoyed it. When I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia and got my master's degree and my doctorate, I did spend some time in the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, and I took the Introduction to City Planning course at the graduate school level there as well, and took a hard look at urban design. We find that between my master's and my doctorate, I was the director of community development for Greene County, Virginia. And one of the things that I had to do in that capacity was oversee the county planning department. So the county planner and all the functions and activities of that particular office fell under my supervision, and I had to learn a lot more about planning than I had known previously. Of course, after my teaching career is on its way, I, of course, ended up being the policy director of the Pennsylvania State Senate, and in that capacity, many, many, many pieces of legislation that we had proposed or crafted or were investigating had to do with city planning as well. So when I first began to teach, the Lake Superior State College didn't have a city planning course, and I had proposed one, and they had accepted it. Same thing with Ferrum College, And then when I came back to Millersville, I was able to offer it again, and we've offered city planning ever since I've come here in 1987. So it's a little bit of background on that subject. But let's take a look at what is a city and the history of the city. You find that as we do this, I'd like you to have your PowerPoints beside you or with an easy access. So as I lecture on video, you have the PowerPoints with you, and it'll go very smoothly. I think it'll be a big help, and you'll get more out of both the lecture and the PowerPoints if you do it that way. The PowerPoints are sort of your blueprint, your pathway to negotiating, navigating this class throughout the semester with me. But you find that most definitions of cities have been ethnocentric. They, for the most part, ones that we're familiar with are always based on the modern day Western city. Louis Wirth is one of the foremost city planning theorists. He studied the city for a generation, and Louis Wirth's definition of the city is very widespread and well accepted. Louis Wirth, W-I-R-T-H, Louis Wirth says, quote, "A city is a relatively large, dense, and permanent settlement of socially heterogeneous individuals," unquote. So a city is a relatively large, dense, and permanent settlement of socially heterogeneous individuals. It's our first definition. Find we also have Gordon Childe, C-H-I-L-D-E, C-H-I-L-D-E, Gordon Childe. He says that a city is a settlement if it meets 10 criteria, or I should say that a settlement is a city, excuse me. A settlement is a city if it can meet 10 criteria. We have to go through those criteria very carefully. Number one would be a concentration of large numbers of people. That's the first necessary element to have a city, according to Gordon Childe. Secondly, you have to have a specialization of crafts. Third, there is some redistribution in society involved with their economic system. So you have a redistributive economic mode. Number four, you have monumental public architecture. Monumental public architecture. Number five, for settlement to be considered a city, you have to have developed some amount of social stratification. Number six, you have the use of writing. Number seven, you've developed exact and predictive sciences. Number eight, you have naturalistic art. Number nine, you have foreign trade. And number 10, you have group membership. And group membership is based on where you live. Group membership is based on residence rather than on kinship. Now, there are exceptions to Gordon Childe's list that can certainly be found throughout history. You find as we go back to some of the earliest cities that we know of, and you can see pictures of them on your PowerPoints. We can go back to the Middle East and look at Jericho, for example. We can go further east and look at Catalhayuk, and we can come to the Americas and look at various settlements that were created before Columbus came here, or what, of course, we just refer to as pre-Columbian settlements that predate writing. All of these things, these particular settlements predated the development of writing. Jorge Horde has criteria as well to determine what constitutes a city. And he has 6 different criteria that help him define what a city is. And his first name is spelled Jorge, Jorge. And then Horde is Horday. So Jorge. What are his criteria? Well, he thinks that for a settlement to be considered a city, that number one, it needs a bit of permanency. It needs to be a permanent settlement. So permanency. Number two is that you'll have a large size and population for its time and for its space. Number three, there would be a minimum density for its time and space. Number four, a settlement, that is a city, would be a place where people live and where people work. Number five, urban structures and layout would be easy to see and would be recognizably urban streets and spaces. You have a minimum of specifically urban functions, and the minimum of urban functions would include, well, you'd have to have a market. So number one, you have to have a market. Number two, you'd have to have administrative and political center. So you want to have a market, an administrative or political center. You want to have a military center. You want to have a religious center. And you want to have a center of intellectual activity with all the corresponding institutions that would go along with that. Number seven, Jorge Horday's list is longer. It's looks like it's 10 elements, not 6. Number 7 would be there'd have to be a hierarchical heterogeneity and differentiation of society. So society would have to be differentiated, and you'd have a hierarchical heterogeneity. Number 8, a city is a center of the urban economy for its time and space, and it would link the agricultural hinterlands and processing raw materials for a larger market. So the city would have to be a center of urban economy. Number 9, it's a center of services for the neighboring areas. And number 10, it's a center of diffusion. In other words, it helps promote an urban way of life throughout the region and for its time and space again. There are a number of other cultures that have a number of other necessary elements for the settlement to be considered a city, for example. A Greek city or Hellenistic city in the ancient world. Hellenistic city would have to possess a theater, would have to possess a gymnasium, and it would have to possess a pyroterium. A pyroterium is where a pyre would be built to essentially cremate those who had passed on. When you go to Rome, right in front of the rebuilt ancient Senate structure, the building that was the Senate, and it's completely restored in the Forum in Rome. If you go out the front door, you turn a little bit to the right, go up the hill a little bit, you find that there was the Pyroterium for at least the Roman Republic, and that is where Julius Caesar was put on a pyre and sent to the next existence. There are other examples of cities in other cultures. For example, if you wanted to have a medieval Islamic city, what would a medieval Islamic city have to have? It would have to have a mosque. It would have to have a permanent market. It would need a public bath. So a medieval Islamic city had to have a mosque, a permanent marketplace, and a public bath. When you go to Mesopotamia, you go to Cambodia, or you go to the Mayan Empire here in the New World, what did their cities have? Their cities had to have a temple. A temple. A European city, a European medieval city, had to have fortifications. It had to have a marketplace. It needed to have autonomy. It needed to have, as if you will, independence vis-a-vis other political structures. And it had to have a court that enforced its laws. A court that enforced its laws. So there are other examples of cities in other cultures. For example, in India, what did a city need to possess in Italy? In India, excuse me. In India, a city had to have a temple, a palace, and a market. So in India, a city would gain its status from having a temple, a palace, and a market. In early China, a city had to have an altar to the god of the soil, an altar to the god of the soil. In early China, a city had to have large walls surrounding the settlement, and it had to have a temple that was dedicated to the ancestors of the rulers. So in early China, a city had to have an altar to the gods of the soil. It had to have walls protecting it, and a temple dedicated to the ancestors of the rulers. Well, what we find is that what we regard as a city varies from culture to culture to culture. But this leads us to what we've been looking at and considering, leads us to a general definition. What is a general definition for the city? A general definition for the city is, quote, a settlement that organizes a region and creates effective space. A settlement that organizes. A settlement that organizes a region and creates effective space. A settlement that organizes a region and creates effective space. And the effective space is recognized and it's usable. What are some other thoughts about what is a city? What is necessary to have a city? We can also look upon a city as being a built environment. It's a built environment, and in this built environment we find there's the need to do what? There's the need to organize space, to organize meaning, to organize communication, and time. So another way that we can look at or consider a city is that it's nothing more than a built environment. And the built environment organizes space, meaning, communication, and time. Well, let's take a look at some cities in the ancient world. And I do want you to have your PowerPoints by your side as we go through this. Let's go first to the Fertile Crescent, that area that goes from the Nile River in Egypt and it arcs through Israel and the Holy Land and up through the rivers of Iraq. The arc follows the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It's in that area that we see the beginnings of civilization. For example, it is the Sumerians and the Assyrians that are credited for developing city kingdoms. You find that there were warrior kings that built these cities as fortresses and as marketplaces. And they wanted to have these cities to have markets, if you will, for agricultural products of the surrounding areas. You find that the Sumerians and Assyrians, the city kingdoms that they had, were perhaps equivalent to modern planned cities. The population of these cities at that point was anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 people, and city life generally centered around it was generally about 100 feet high, a zaggorat. And the zaggorat was a temple uh, and an observatory, a temple and an observatory. I have in your PowerPoints some examples of some pictures that give you examples of some of the structures. I have pictures of the ziggurat at one of the first cities ever built, at Ur in modern day Iraq. I show you a picture of the ziggurat in 1930 and a picture of it today. Well, what is the basic layout of the city kingdom? You have the basic layout being massive walls that surround the city, and they surround the ziggurat, they surround the palace, and they would surround the other buildings that were necessary. The best known Sumerian, if we're looking at the modern day Iraq and the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys, the best known Sumerian city was Babylon. Babylon, of course, may have had a population that was as high as 10,000 people. And in that particular city, they had something called the Hanging Gardens. And the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the wonders of the ancient world, one of the wonders of the ancient world. In fact, you can see a recreation, a picture that attempts to recreate what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon looked like. And you can see that in your PowerPoints. Try to think of in the past when I was in school, we had to learn all the wonders of the ancient world. See if you can, how many of them you can name. Well, Egyptian civilization was flourishing at the same time. Find the Egyptian cities were smaller than Sumerian cities, smaller than Assyrian cities. Now, there were some exceptions to this, and the exceptions to this were the temporary cities that the Egyptians used to house all the workers that they would utilize in building these various pyramids. Of course, the one pyramid that stands out is the Great Elon Pyramid. And in order to build that pyramid, you have one city, Kuhun, which may have had 20,000 people at one time. A very large temporary city, don't you think? Well, we have a picture in your PowerPoints of the Great Elon Pyramid, what it looks like today. We find that other civilizations that were building cities could also be found in the Indus River Valley. Of course, that's now Pakistan, and in the Yellow River Valley. And of course, the Yellow River Valley couldn't be seen, of course, in China. Well, as we went down the pathway of history and we tried to work with this human settlement pattern that we called a city, we find that there were people who were spending more time studying it. And perhaps we can decide that the first person who would perhaps be considered a professional city planner in the old world was Hippodamus. Hippodamus was trained as an architect in Greece. And he went out after his training to observe the cities in ancient Egypt and in ancient Samaria. When he spent his time studying these cities, it led him to a theory that he developed, and the theory was that for a city to be effective, it needed a rectangular street system. And this is the beginning of the gridiron pattern that we find basically in all major cities. Well, I'm sorry. We find that Hippodamus should be considered our first city planner. He was trained as an architect in Greece, as I said before, and he had developed the idea of the gridiron pattern for cities. That's where I paused. He also developed the notion of the agora. The agora is a rectangular space in the center of the city, and that rectangular space would be used then as a marketplace for the goods, various products and goods that the people in the city and the surrounding areas would try to exchange with one another. So the agora is a distinct spot, but generally it was located in proximity to the Pinks. Again, agora is spelled A-G-O-R-A, A-G-O-R-A. The Pinks is spelled P-N-Y-X, P-N-Y-X. The Pinks was an area, a rectangular area, that was reserved just for political assembly and for governing activities. That's a word that we don't see used or are not very familiar with in the modern day world, the Pinks. I have pictures that I've offered to you in your PowerPoints of an agora in Greece, and I also have a picture of the port that Hippodamus designed for the city of Athens. Of course, that's Piraeus, and you see the beautiful harbor that he built and the well-protected harbor that he built for that particular city to serve the commercial and and needs of the Athenians. Well, what else can we talk about with Hippodamus? He not only planned Piraeus, he planned roads. You find that his designs for cities were used in many of the Greek colonial towns that were built, specifically along the shores of Turkey and in the islands of the Mediterranean. During his period of time, we find Athens grew from 40,000 citizens. Um, I'm sorry, it grew to 40,000 citizens. So during Hippodamus's life, Athens does grow, it does expand, it does prosper, and it grew to be as large as 40,000 citizens and about 100,000 slaves and foreigners. He personally believed that Athens, as the capital of the Athenian Empire, if you will, as the league that Athens created and oversaw, that it was appropriate as a capital city that it should have that many people. But Hippodamus did have a strong belief that I'd like you to keep in mind. He believed that the ideal sized city was 10,000 people. He thought 10,000 people was just about right, so you could handle the necessary, the needs that one had for hygiene and to have readily available food and readily available water. So he believed that 10,000 was about the right size for a city. Well, you find that the Greek city-states, of course, were finally overwhelmed by the Roman Empire, and Rome invades and does conquer Greece in 146 BC, 146 years before the birth of Christ. We find that the Roman Empire occupies and subjugates the Greek city-states. Now, Romans, on the other hand, were not fearful of large-scale settlements. They're not afraid of them at all. And in fact, under the first Roman Emperor, Augustus, you find that you had 8-story buildings being built in Rome. 8-story buildings. However, this led to perhaps the first zoning in history. We find that the Romans decided to limit all the buildings in Rome to a 70-foot height. So the 70-foot height was perhaps the first example that we have of city zoning in history. Now, the estimates of the number of people that Rome had vary in size from 250,000 to 2 million. We're not sure which is the more accurate of the two figures. In order to deal with the need for large amounts of water, the Romans constructed very large and very well functioning aqueducts, and the aqueducts brought in water from all over the empire for the citizens of Rome. I have pictures in the PowerPoints of the Roman Forum and of one of the aqueducts. This particular aqueduct is still there today and can still be seen in Segovia, Spain. Of course, the Roman Forum was the center of the capital, and you can still go there and see the ruins today that are well preserved and taken care of. We find that the Romans can claim to be not only planners, but they are the first regional planners that we can see. So the Romans get credit for being the first regional planners. They planned roads and they built roads throughout all of the empire. Those roads were primarily used for military purposes, but they also facilitated the flow of commerce. One of the best examples of this, of course, is the Appian Way. The Appian Way is a famous road that goes from the northern tips of Italy to the southern tip. The Appian Way, with the focal point being Rome, of course. And when you go to Rome, you can still see stretches of the Appian Way which have been preserved. Well, we find that the Romans utilized pretty much a master plan to build cities, and this master plan was one which was used to construct numerous numbers of military cities throughout the empire. It was thought that Roman citizens would help colonize these new territories better. It would help stem the migration of all the folks into the capital. So they have a master plan for the construction of military cities. They essentially built the military cities in a square pattern. They had civic buildings at the main intersection, and housing for the residents of these cities was primarily done in apartment buildings. Find that urban life and the need for urban planning fell or diminished in the West, at least, with the collapse of Rome. Rome collapses in 476 AD. You find that after the collapse of Rome in the West in 476 AD, you have the development of the feudal order and medieval society. And this essentially persists all the way until the 11th century. During this time, we have a feudal order developing. We find that the large landowners, or what were considered to be the royalty, they would offer protection to serfs or farmers in the surrounding areas if those serfs would give them 10% of their agricultural produce. They would let them have shelter, and they'd help to defend them. And so that was the arrangement, the symbiotic relationship that grew between the Roman citizens and these people who were hoping to stay as Roman citizens. Well, the feudal order was established, and behind the walls of medieval cities, new marketplaces were built. You find that the walls begin to disappear really in the 15th century. In the 15th century, we have the more widespread if you will, construction of walls and changes the nature of the city. Of course, the walls slowly but surely disappear as gunpowder becomes more and more commonplace. You find in Vienna, you go to the capital of Austria, and the city of Vienna is a great example of what many of the cities did with their walls. They simply used them, once they were torn down, as a ring for traffic around the city. So in Vienna, you have something called the Ringstrasse, the ring streets that were built on the old walls of the city and help you get around the center of town. I have pictures in your PowerPoint again of what Vienna looked like during the late portion of the medieval times, and I have an aerial view of what the city of Vienna's Ringstrasse looks like today. Well, during the Renaissance, we find that our definition and our view of the city changes a bit. In the Renaissance period, now you have the cities being designed around not a gridiron fashion, not streets running up and down and then straight across, but now we have an axis style of city design. We have many streets intersecting with one another at one point, and then all the streets radiate out from this intersection. This was considered to be a Renaissance design, the axis style of city design. We find also that in the Renaissance you would have the use of very formal piazzas and squares. Piazzas, squares, plazas were incorporated into many of the best designs during the Renaissance for cities. And you find that these designs, these ideas, were fostered by Michelangelo, and they were fostered by, of course, the famous Italian sculptor Bernini. So they both did this. I have pictures again in here from the Renaissance, from Venice, and from Rome. I have pictures from Venice and Rome to try to illustrate the axis style of city design and the smattering of material about the use of piazzas and squares. Well, we move from the Renaissance period in the cities to the Baroque era. And this really happens in the 17th century and the 18th century. So during the 1600s and the 1700s, we're making this transition to the Baroque era. Here what we found is the Baroque period. Folks take the urban design that's used during the Renaissance period, and what they do is they embellish upon it. They create huge open spaces now in the Baroque city. Huge open spaces. We have the construction of much more grand public monuments. And lastly, we find that the center line of the city and the central axis of the city, they both are heavily embellished. And they're heavily embellished to symbolize the power and the radiance of the ruling family, of the monarchs. So these are, again, different styles that really shine forth during the Baroque era. Eventually, we find that we are encountering the Industrial Revolution, the beginnings of the development of the Industrial Revolution. In 1769, we have the invention of the steam engine. And with the invention of the steam engine does come the development of the Industrial Revolution. You find that the key to industrialization in the minds of many was simply transportation. transportation. We find that we needed to move raw materials to market, and we needed to move finished products from the places they were manufactured out to agoras, to marketplaces, and out to the greater public. We find that as the industrial city is developed, we build more new streets. We are going to now build railways. We're going to expand upon shipping and shipping channels. And we have canals being developed as well. These are all very important instruments in the industrial city. Find that the fact that, again, we do very little planning in many instances as the industrial city develops leads us to come back. So we have new streets, new railways, new shipping channels, new canals, but we have very little planning when it comes to the industrial city. Very little planning. Now, with the industrial city comes something that we haven't seen before, and that is a commute to work. The commute to work. You find that work had always been conducted at home or in small shops. It was very close to home. But now that we have mechanization occurring with industry, you have that the fact that this mechanization really needs to be housed in a factory. So we have this phenomena of city life, this commute to work, and now we have the work being done in mechanized places. We find that cities open up even more through this than they did with the invention of gunpowder. Of course, gunpowder eliminates the need for walls, but cities now opened up even more. Well, as the industrial city continues to develop, we have increasing congestion, increasing health hazards, and we slowly but surely find people moving towards the suburbs. The suburbs became possible because of urban railway systems which had been built, and eventually the improvement of streets. You certainly find that the invention of the automobile helps restructure the industrial city and restructure America and American transportation. So the invention of the automobile consummated the development of the industrial cities. Cities began to develop so quickly and so rapidly at the beginning of the 20th century that you find that the city started to plan and started to govern for the need for certain infrastructure, that the cities would need new streets, better streets. They would need better facilities for water and for sewer. And so these are all things that they had hoped to have. So the cities grew rapidly at the beginning of the 20th century. City governments slowly realized their need to plan and build the infrastructure of the cities, streets, water, and sewer facilities, for example. Well, this leads us to another topic, and this is the topic of company towns. Let me see if we can stop here.